So we are continuing on with our discussion on Chapter 2. And I think that we left off talking about a minimum tipped wage. So again, minimum tipped wage is $2.13 an hour. Does not pertain to Montana because we've got to pay our employees here in Montana full $8.05 an hour. But most places that have tipped employees, the employer only has to pay $2.13 an hour, and then hopefully the server's clients make up the difference. Overtime. The Fair Labor Standards Act requires overtime. Overtime must be paid at least 1.5 times the regular rate for anything over 40 hours a week. And the employer can set a work week to be anything he or she wants. It can be Sunday through Saturday or Tuesday through Monday, doesn't matter, but you just have to apply it consistently, and it has to be 7 consecutive 24-hour periods. And then that last bullet talks about the fact that in some states, again, not Montana, but in some states, you have to pay overtime over 8 hours a day. So for example, in California, which can really muck around with things like people want to work 4/10s, right? Especially when you've got like a big commute. So, but that's just state law, and then you have to comply with it if you're an employer in that state. Okay, an employer, and this is sometimes puzzling to people, an employer can require employees to work overtime. You can be required, mandatorily to work overtime. If I'm owning a print shop and I've got to get a job out, or I'm a software developer and I've got, crunch time on my product development turnover, I can require my workers to work overtime. And then I've got to pay 1.5 times over 40 hours a week, with some notable exceptions. And here are the types of exceptions. In hospitals, you only have to pay overtime over 80 hours in a 14-day period, right? Instead of 40 hours in 1 week. Remedial education, employees receiving remedial education, and retail or service industry, but there's some very specific rules around that. I think there's a chart in your book that talks about these items. I guess I don't have the chart number, figure number written down. But there's a list of exceptions in your book. Compensatory time off. Comp time is, I think, really misunderstood. If you were, so there's 2 types of employees. There's an exempt employee and a non-exempt employee. And that means exempt from the Fair Labor Standards Act overtime provision, or non-exempt from the Fair Labor Standards Act's overtime provision. If you're a non-exempt employee, in other words, you have to be paid overtime, they can't give you comp time. In other words, hey, work 50 hours this week and then 30 next week and we'll be even. You see what I'm saying? Why can't they do that if you're not exempt? Fair Labor Standards Act says you've got to pay me overtime over 40 hours a week. This is really misunderstood. You see this abused quite a bit, and I don't know that it's really intentional as much as just people don't know the law. So say that I've got that print shop, and I've got a really big crunch job that needs to go out by the 10th of every month. So I ask all of you to work, Saturday, and then I tell you next week, don't come in on Monday. I can't do that if you're non-exempt employees. Okay. So in very specific situations, I can grant you compensatory time called comp time, but it's generally not allowed. So I can do it if you're in public safety or emergency response, so like our firefighters, our EMTs, you can accrue and distribute comp time for them. But there's really very, very few examples of kinds of non-exempt employees that I can grant comp time for. General rule of thumb, can't do it. Yeah.
And employers, they can do that if they want, if they're willing to pay that overtime.
Sure.
And still save themselves some money next week if they don't want to.
Sure. The problem is you're probably Well, I guess in the example of the print shop where that happens the 10th of every month, it's predictable for employees, right? But most people, like, I've got daycare issues or something. How am I going to get daycare on Saturday? I mean, for most employees, that's not a feasible management style or feasible schedule to manage. But if it's predictable, yeah, sure. Why wouldn't I want to pick up time and a half one week and then trade that off for 8 hours off the next?
If it's just a unusual thing, like we've got this massive project.
Right.
Deadline,
Right.
Work, everybody's following.
Right. Sure. Yeah, you can require, but I mean, I think if you're gonna retain employees, you're gonna have to tell them what the situation is when you hire them, and help them to kind of pre-plan for it. Because for a whole lot of people, transportation, daycare, all that stuff isn't feasible to make happen on a short time frame. Okay, so this is arguably one of the most important things you will learn in this chapter, is this definition between exempt and non-exempt. An exempt employee, these are the only types of employees that are exempt from the overtime provisions of the Fair Labor Standards Act. If you're a white collar worker, as outlined in figure 2.2. Okay, so basically the umbrella for those white collar workers are executives, administrators, and professionals. And there's a whole series, I think I might have that on the next. Yeah. So let's kind of talk about this. So this is at figure 2.2, and then I'll go back and reference the prior slide. So if you're an executive, basically, so what they're trying to get around here is, I hire you as my office manager. You're basically a receptionist. You make coffee, you do my scheduling, you do my travel plans, you greet clients as they walk in the office. But I call you my office executive, and I put you on salary, and I work you 50 hours a week. Okay, I can't do that because you're an executive in name only. In other words, you don't meet these actual distinct bullet points that identify what an executive is. Your primary duty needs to be managing. You need to supervise 2 or more employees. You've got to have the authority to hire, fire, and promote. That's what makes you an executive, not your title. So I really recommend you really need to know this chart. What is an administrator? Well, it's somebody that has the ability to use discretion. And they actually, when you dial in, it tells you that 40% or more of your job needs to be discretionary. So I decide how I'm going to do it. Professional, if you're a professional, you've got some sort of advanced education tapped into that designation, right? Some sort of college or other sort of career and technical education. Business owner, you own at least 20% of the equity. Highly compensated, you're in 134 grand a year or more. Computer professionals, you're in systems analysis. Creative professional, you're an inventor, or you originate or author your own work, and outside salespeople. These are the only 8 categories of exempt. If you're anything else, you're non-exempt, which means you have to be paid overtime. You're non-exempt from the overtime provisions of the FLSA. Now, one of the biggest issues is these mid-level managers at big box stores really get caught up in this definition. Because when you look at executive, yeah, they manage, yeah, they supervise 2 or more employees, et cetera, but they only were earning, $500-600 a week. So they fell through the cracks on this example, on this designation. They were designated as exempt from the Fair Labor Standards Act because they made more than $455 a week. They recently tried to raise that number to $913 a week. And of course, the lobbyists that promulgate on behalf of big box stores fought this really hardly, and right now it's held up in court. So it's still, the number is $455 a week. So these folks, because they oftentimes I'm just making this up, but say a Best Buy, would work 60 or 70 hours a week, but you're a manager, so you're exempt. Well, not really. I spend a lot of time out on the floor. I only make $500 a week. So this is one of the groups that kind of falls through the cracks. But just make sure that you understand that basically blue collar workers are always entitled to overtime. And just because you hire someone and put them on salary, that does not mean they are exempt. And that's what we're going to be working on today. Probably should find our calculators and pencils to start crunching out some overtime calculations. For people that I hire, I put on salary, but they're not exempt, and then you work overtime. How do I compensate you? Okay, this, I guess this doesn't really pertain to the top up there, but let me just address this bottom bullet, which is, so for example, I'm an exempt employee, right, because I'm a professional. So nobody cares how many hours a week I work, right? I'm just paid the same salary because I'm exempt from the overtime provisions of the Fair Labor Standards Act. So if I'm sick for a couple days in the week, I don't get 3/5 of my paycheck, right? But the first and the last week that I start the university, the very first week I start employment, and the very last week that I leave it, only in those 2 weeks can I get a proportional share of my salary. In other words, if I started my job on a Thursday, I could get 2/5 of that week's salary for Thursday and Friday. At the very end of my career here, if I stop work on a Wednesday, they can cut me my check for 3/5 of that week. But that's the only time you can do that to exempt employees. Okay, Equal Pay Act. Equal Pay Act says, was tacked on or amended to the Fair Labor Standards Act, and basically it says that if there's wage gaps based on gender, that you have to raise the lower person's rate to meet the higher person's pay rate. And this law has been utilized in, historically many, many different venues, many different industries to equalize the pay differential. Still is a pretty staggering pay differential in this country. Anybody have any idea what women on the average make compared to their male counterparts? I think the last I read as a national average was 82 cents on the dollar. But like that 74 cents could well be like a Montana number. It's pretty staggering, and this law has been in place for 40 years.
What's that statistic based on?
Average pay.
Like of the same job?
Yes, absolutely. Average. So you're a welder, I'm a welder. You're a nurse, I'm a nurse. It's average.
I just kind of find that hard to believe since men and women do such different jobs.
Like what?
Like women dominate the medical industry.
They
men
do?
Dominate like oil fields.
So it's not saying like, let's take an oil field worker versus a nurse, which in the hospitals I've been in recently, I wouldn't necessarily say that women, but maybe they do statistically. But that's not what it's saying. It's not comparing an oil field worker's salary to a nurse's salary. It's comparing male nurses to women nurses. And, somebody that works on the rigs as a woman to somebody that works on the rigs as a man. It's like kind jobs. I think it's...
hours into...
It does, and I think, I would have to look. I think actually it probably has in your book, it references the study. I'm somehow thinking it's a Census Bureau study, but that doesn't seem quite right. Maybe an Economic Bureau study or Department of Labor. Just make a note of that. I will look that up, Cody, because I don't know exactly. I can't tell you off the...
People saying that the statistic is concrete, and other people say it's kind of not concrete.
Yeah, anecdotally, I see it all the time. Anecdotally, as a tax preparer who sees tons of W-2s, I would feel like, yeah, that looks about right from just what my eyes have gone over a million times in the last 30 years. But that's a good point. I'd like to pull the actual study up on gender differential. It can't be Census Bureau because it's published every year. I see the number every year. It just crossed 80 cents on the dollar 2 years ago. It was in the 70s for a really long time. Okay, what else does the FLS say? Other things that the FLSA says is that you can't employ, severely restricts child labor, okay? You remember the FLSA was promulgated what year? Do you remember? Roughly? Early 38? Yeah. So 80 years old, right? So with child labor before that, you know, let them employ kids, and a lot of people did employ kids, and it was, you know, actually a pretty, you know, abusive situation in lots of industries. So kids in non-farming, kids 16 and 17 can work an unlimited number of hours each week. If you're 14 or 15, you're restricted to hours before and after school, and how many hours a week you can work, and it's very limited in the kinds of industry sectors that you're allowed to work in. Okay, for 16 and 17-year-olds, it can't be in anything hazardous. Then agricultural occupations, which is obviously we're talking about basically hand-picked ag labor. It's got its whole own set of rules. It's the result of lots of aggressive lobbying by the you know, by the big ag organizations, Monsanto and Archer and et cetera. And basically it says that kids as young as 10 and 11 can work as hand laborers, hand-picked laborers in the months between, as I say, the 1st of June and the 15th of October. And there's a lot of restrictions on it. You've got to have certifications showing their age, but it's still pretty darn young for, you know, in my opinion, for kids to be working. But in general, kids under 12 are prohibited from working, except for this situation of hand laborers. Yes, ma'am.
What if it's a business? You know, like kids behind registers,
That's a really good point. This is my off-the-cuff answer, and I'm not 100% sure of this, but my guess is that they're not being compensated.
Right.
So it's not a true employment relationship.
Volunteering their time kind of
Right.
thing.
Yeah, but they could be getting like a, what's it called? What do you call it for doing children allowance? An allowance. They could be getting an allowance from their parents.
They could be getting an allowance. I'm pretty sure that if I've got
Yeah.
my 9 or 10-year-old, you know, helping customers behind my food truck stall, that it's not a true employment relationship, because that would be prohibited. I.e., they're not getting, you know, turning in their hours and getting a paycheck. But maybe they are getting some allowance.
So with like the 10 or 11 year olds, like the W.
Oh, yeah, handheld laborers or hand harvest laborers fill out W-2 or W-4s, they submit I-9s, they've got to be verified for authenticity to work.
Parents do that then? Like be in charge of that?
Yep. You need to have a certificate of age on file. Child labor provisions, if you violate them, obviously can result in very serious fines. Okay, if you have a wage claim, so I feel that I've been violated according to the Fair Labor Standards Act, that I am a non-exempt employee, for example, and I haven't been being paid overtime. Or I'm contesting how my pay is calculated based on my employment contract. This is called wage theft, and there's lots of different venues to redress your grief around this, or to redress your misdeed around this, perceived misdeed, alleged misdeed. You can go through your state Department of Labor, and if you're not satisfied there, you can actually seek recourse through the federal civil suits, and even criminal suits if you can produce documentation to show that it was willful and neglectful wage theft. Okay, what the FLSA does not cover. Okay, the FLSA does not tell us that you have to get paid extra for weekends or holidays. It does not require that you pay for any time off. It does not require that you give holidays off, or that you provide vacation leave, or that you provide sick leave. Okay, most people don't realize that. They feel somehow that those are rights. They're not. Any amount of time that you're given off, PTO, paid time off for sick or vacation or anything like that, that is totally not non-mandatory. And that's a benefit that your employer is providing you. Okay, so then there's a lot of these things are probably things you maybe have ever even thought about, but there's a lot of court cases and conversation around what actually constitutes my work time. And these are just examples of some things that have come before courts and have been adjudicated so that we can more clearly identify what principal work time is. So, for example, prep at a workstation. So I'm a fry cook, and I have to come in at 5:30 to start up my grill, my fry station, but I don't start cooking till 6 a.m. when the door is open. Okay, do I have to be paid for that half hour? Absolutely, that's part of my principal work time. Travel, I'm a CNA, and I go in the morning, I get my caseload for the day and the medical records or whatever, and then I go from client to client's home all day. Do I have to be paid for my time getting between my clients' homes, my patients' homes? Sure, it's part of my principal workday. Do I have to be paid for the time when I leave my house and go to pick up my caseload for the day? No, that's commuting. Idle time or wait time, I work on some sort of bottling line, and every 2 hours they have to come in and do a sterility test that takes 10 minutes, so the line shuts down. Do they have to pay me for that? Sure, it's part of my principal workday. Rest periods of less than 20 minutes each, they cannot make you check out. So if they give you a break, every 4 hours you get a 15-minute break from whatever you do, like say you're a cashier. Okay? They cannot make me clock out for something less than 20 minutes. Okay, that's paid. Meal periods are generally not compensable. In other words, they don't have to pay me for that time, unless it's something like, well, you don't have to be working, but you can't really leave your desk because we need somebody to greet customers when they walk in the door at the flooring shop. Well, so okay, I can be looking through a magazine and eating my salad, but I can't be running an errand, right? So that time is compensable, if that's the situation. Okay, anything that you do at home is considered a principal activity, even if you're not told specifically to take work home. So this gets to be pretty tricky, particularly in this day and age when people are sort of constantly working. I'm constantly checking my email. I'm constantly responding. I've got a 10-minute Skype, at 6 o'clock while I'm cooking dinner for the kids. I mean, things like that, right? So this gets very, very tricky to document because there's this idea of, consistently or constantly working. But what the law says is that you need to be paid for, if you're non-exempt, be paid for your work at home, even if you're not asked to take it home, just if you're doing it. Now, obviously, this is going to cause trouble with your employer. If you're non-exempt and at the end of the week you turn in a 48-hour time card, and she says, well, I didn't tell you to take home 8 hours of work this week. I mean, you can be penalized through the employee policy manual for doing things like that, but according to the FLSA, you've got to be paid for it. Employers should have a clear statement in their policy manual on email work outside of clocked-in hours for hourly staff. Okay, they've got to pay you for sleep if you're required to be on duty less than 24 hours. So, for example, if you go to one of the youth homes and you spend the night, right, and you're just there if the kids need anything or if there's some sort of, emergency over at night, but you also, you're going to sleep right along with everybody else because you work between 11 and 7 and that's what you're doing. They have to pay you for that. Training sessions. Okay, you've got to come in. We're all going to do, we're getting a new computer system. And the next 3 Saturdays, everybody's got to come in between, 9 and 1. Got to pay you for that training session. Karen? No, your sleep time is your principal activity if you're working less than 24 hours. So if you're sleeping and you're working less than 24 hours, it's considered your principal activity if, if that's you're part of basically, like the example with the youth homes, they work in, I think they work 12-hour shifts actually. So they go in at 7 o'clock, they help the kids with their homework, blah, 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 get organized for the next day. They go to bed, everybody goes to bed, and then they get them off to school, and then they're off the clock. So they've got to be paid for that sleep time. Waiting for a doctor's appointment on site. I've got to take what's it called? Urine test, or that's not the name of it. A drug test, thank you. So I'm waiting on site for something like that. Or, whatever the case may be. That was actually a court case. You've got to be paid for that. Non-compensable activities, you do not need to be paid if you're tardy. You do need to be paid for fractional pieces of an hour, and that can be as small as 6-minute increments, which is 1/10 of an hour, or as much as 0.25, which is a quarter of an hour, 15 minutes. There's all sorts of different kinds of records for timekeeping. Used to be the old-fashioned timesheets. Now you can have badge system, you can have retinal scans, you can have online logins, next generation technology, biometrics, interactive voice response. There's lots of different ways to clock in and out now. So I'm going to leave off here. We're going to start on Monday with the actual calculations.